Coming up, Florida's governor facing mounting legal troubles after transporting migrants from the southern border to Martha's Vineyard. But could it lead to criminal charges? An expert weighs in next. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis faces several legal challenges nearly 2 weeks after sending undocumented migrants to Martha's Vineyard. The migrants were flown from Texas to Florida and then on to Martha's Vineyard in what a Texas sheriff called a predatory operation. A federal class action lawsuit by the migrants this week alleges a premeditated and fraudulent scheme by Governor DeSantis, and a Florida senator also filing suit challenging the use of a $12 million migrant relocation fund. The governor has brushed off the claim, saying all of the migrants got on the plane voluntarily. And joining us now is Dr. Alex Del Carmen. He's the Associate Dean and Professor at the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Public Administration at Tarleton State University. Thank you so much for joining us on this Sunday. Appreciate it. Governor Ron DeSantis has been hit on several fronts this week for the controversial tactic he let play out last week, sending those migrants to Martha's Vineyard. So now he's facing a class action lawsuit, a criminal investigation, and there are questions about whether he even misused state funds. So when it comes to that criminal investigation, do you think Governor DeSantis will actually face any criminal charges? And if so, what kind of charges would he face?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think that the bottom line is it's going to be up to the prosecutors to see what exactly they're going to be charging him with, which ultimately is dependent upon the investigation, right? Remember that the investigation is being led by Bexar County Sheriff's Office, which basically means it's a Texas entity that has Texas jurisdiction only. That is not to say that if they find some alleged violation of federal law that they could refer this to the U.S. Attorney's Office, which basically presents a bigger problem for the governor.
And, you know, like, we're looking at these pictures right now, like, these are human beings. We can't forget that who is involved with all this. Is there a case of human rights abuse in any of this?
You know, potentially, but I think the governor is facing more serious problems than those, right? As you noted in the interview, you know, he's got a state senator in Florida that has already filed a lawsuit as a citizen against him. And the lawsuit is basically based on the notion that the governor used money that has been appropriated by federal funding in order to be able to transport individuals from the state of Texas ultimately to Martha's Vineyard. So the point here is that the allegation is that he is misappropriating those funds, is using them in a way that they were not intended to be used. Because they do have a federal connection, I think the problem for him is going to be whether or not there's going to be an enforcement by the feds as it relates to that.
So let's talk about the civil case more. Those migrants say they were told they were headed to Boston or Washington, D.C. before ending up ultimately at Martha's Vineyard. So they also said they were misled, promised cash, employment, or housing assistance. Do those migrants have a case?
I think they do, right? So first of all, you know, there are allegations that there was someone like a point of contact or someone on the ground that was representing the governor. And I think that, you know, they're trying to identify who this person was. Allegedly, her name was Perla, and they're trying to find out who she was representing, what exactly she said. But there are enough people right now that were part of that transportation scheme that they did 2 weeks ago, that they're trying to figure out exactly what it is that was said to them. But if you have enough people telling you the same story, and they're trying to identify someone that allegedly said that story, the connection is going to be easily made between the governor's office and that person that represented him among these individuals that were transported to Martha's Vineyard.
Now, Governor DeSantis isn't the only governor to use this controversial practice. For instance, Texas Governor Greg Abbott or Arizona Governor Doug Ducey have also taken part in similar tactics of sending migrants to these so-called sanctuary cities. Not to say it's a coordinated effort by those governors, but does their practice lead you to believe that they don't believe they're breaking the law, that they're kind of going around the law? What is it that they think they're doing?
Well, I think they're trying to make a political point, right? Which is that, you know, in the case of Arizona and Texas, both of which are states that are affected by the migration issue, and that they're trying to let the rest of the country know that, you know what, we are experiencing this influx of undocumented individuals crossing the border. It's time for the rest of you to feel the effect of that. I think it's a political stunt. Now, I will tell you that in the case of Florida, it's going to be harder for DeSantis to make this case, given the fact that he's surrounded by water. And there are only 2 states that actually have a land proximity to Florida, none of which are bringing undocumented immigrants the way that, say, Texas or Arizona are being affected by that. So he's going to have a harder case to make.
Yeah. And lastly, Governor DeSantis has promised to continue using what he calls appropriated state funds to continue flying the migrants to these sanctuary cities. Are there any legal injunctions that can stop this from preemptively happening?
There could be. The legislators, could actually basically, vote some sort of a bill that would preclude him from doing that. You could also have, more importantly, because obviously he's not going to sign a bill that would go against his own, protocol. But one of the things that could easily happen is I can see that, more lawsuits would be filed, that criminal charges would be brought upon after an investigation is done, all of which are going to be political disasters, and they may be able to disarm him, at the very least limit his ability to do this again.
All right, Dr. Alex Del Carmen, really appreciate your time today. Thank you for your insight.
Thanks for having me.